Today we're going to be working with tonalism. It's a subtle range of color that creates atmosphere. And the colors we're going to be using, I'll start with a mixture of ultramarine blue mixed with Winsor red, or you can choose cad-free red, and then a mixture of the lemon yellow, cad-free yellow mixed with the cad-free red. And there are all my color mixes. As you can see, I start with a pencil sketch underneath. The tonalist movement, one of the hallmarks of it is to create atmosphere. So right now I'm working on the background area with the warm yellow, and I'm going to create a warm atmosphere. So I'm just putting in washes of this yellow mixture, which also has a little bit of cad red in the mixture to in the foreground. So in the background I've used a very cool yellow, and in the foreground where we have a knoll, dry hillside, I'm using a warmer mixture of the yellow. You can work with saturation, coolness, and warmth by the way you mix up your colors. Right now I'm going into the background and I'm adding some water, and that will create that soft blur, wet on wet for the background. Here again, I'm just working on the atmosphere, trying to create a soft underpainting for the background. So I start with the lighter atmospheric colors, and then I'll build up from those light colors. Right now I'm going in with a mix of, it actually looks gray, but it's actually a very light violet mixture, and I created that mixture with the ultramarine blue mixed with the Winsor red. I thinned out that so it was very, very light, and just added a touch of the yellow. And a little bit of the yellow orange mixture is what was able to tone down the violet. Therefore, we get tonalism. So, in essence, what I'm painting as the background area of the trees, that very soft gray atmosphere, started as a mixture of violet, and by adding the opposite of violet, which is yellow, I'm able to tone the violet down to look somewhat like a gray, very, very light gray. Now in the beginning of this painting, I am using very, very thin paints. There's minimal pigment. I'll start very, very light, and then I'll slowly build up the painting by adding more pigment, which will increase saturation. Characteristic of the tonalism movement was to use broad graphic shapes that ultimately are abstract major forms in their reading. So I have this very large abstracted shape in the background, which is just to infer trees in the background. A hallmark of the tonalism movement, which started in 1880 and went to 1915, was that dark and neutral colors of gray, brown, blue, and green were used to create a mood, to create a mood that was easy on the eyes, and wanted to create an emotional response from the viewer. especially when paintings are seen from a distance. The painting was to draw the viewer in. So while working with the large oak tree shape, as you can see, I'm starting with very, very light washes in the background, and I'll save the dark values for later. Now, if you get too dark in the beginning, you can always add water into on your page and then absorb up some of that pigment with your brush. So you can see the mixture I have now. It has a little bit more brown in it. It's less gray as we move to the foreground. And this sienna umberish color is, I'm sticking with the same colors. I just take that violet color and add more of the yellow orange to it, or I can start with my yellow orange and add a little bit of violet to that mixture. You could even see some of those reds coming out in that foreground knoll area. So this is tonalism. There's just very, very subtle changes in the color to create atmosphere. We're using the same three colors and using tones of those colors to create this feeling of atmosphere, distance, and foreground. You can see the colors in the foreground are warmer, and that will tend to bring things to the foreground, the contrast, and the warmer they are. And the cooler colors will go to the background. So now I'm going to put the limbs of the large oak tree in the painting. And as you can see, I'm using a cooler gray. So I take that same violet mixture and I add a little bit more ultramarine to it. Now on my palette, I had 3 puddles mixed. I have uh, 3 different violets. One violet, all the violets are a mixture of ultramarine blue and Windsor red, and you could substitute with Cadfree red if you like. And then I've mixed up 3 puddles, and they're all of varying saturation. Some have more pigment and others have more water. And I'll just go in and experiment. You can see where some of the marks that I'm making are more saturated and some marks are less saturated. And you can see there that puddle is cooler, and as I was moving off to the left, uh, the limbs of the tree are warmer. And you can change that subtle warm and cool color by the amount of ultramarine you add to the mix to get the cooler color, and the amount of the Windsor red you add to get a warmer gray color. And then to really gray it down or turn it toward green, you can add your yellow mixture, the yellow and red mixture. Now as I create the limbs of the tree moving across the page, I am thinking about the twisting, turning volume of that branch. It does get smaller as it goes into the distance, and I want to keep that branch somewhat transparent. I don't want it to get too heavy. And when it gets too heavy, I can go in and lift up some of that color. I'll layer uh, a more saturated gray in front of the lighter gray in the background to bring that cropping of leaves to the foreground. Here I'm just using a very small round brush, a number 4 round brush, and I'm just using the tip of it, moving it around in somewhat of a squiggly way to just give that texture of leaves. When you're looking at a tree, you don't want to paint each individual leaf. You want to look at the abstract shapes created by the shadows um, of a bunch of leaves. Usually there's a limb with a whole cluster of leaves on it. Look at the whole cluster and just create a large organic form that mimics that cluster. Okay, so now I'm continuing to move throughout uh, the top and bottom of the oak branch, just putting in these organic shapes. Um, as I do that, I'll experiment with different tones, different values. I can move warmer by adding some of the yellow or the red, and I can create a cooler shape by adding a little bit more of the ultramarine blue. Keep in mind I do have 3 puddles of very thin violet, and I can move that violet toward a green by adding the yellow, and I can move that violet toward a blue by giving it more ultramarine blue, and I can move that gray violet toward by adding red to be more saturated, leaning toward violet. So that's the key with tonalism, is that you are mixing up one large puddle that you will work from. Okay, so now I've mixed up a much deeper gray, and I'm going in to really look at that shadow side of the tree. Um, so this deep gray is a mixture of the Windsor red, the ultramarine blue, and a larger saturation of the yellow-orange color. So you can see how we can really increase value as well as that deeper gray tone for the bark of the tree. I try to keep the limbs organic, and I'll go in and make some adjustments. As I was working on this, I noticed that contrast between the limbs of the tree and the leaves of the tree was just a little bit too heavy. So you can go in, and what I'm doing is I'm lifting up the excess uh, pigment and water just to lighten it a bit. You don't want to have more than 2 value jumps within your objects, unless you really want to draw attention to that object. So you could see that I'm working with that trunk and deciding what is going to be the right value. It's just moving back and forth. If you put in a value that's too heavy, you can just put some water into that area with your brush, dry your brush, and then lift up the pigment. Okay, now I am going into the, the background path. There is a driveway that goes up and into the scene, and so I'm just putting some uh, indications of shrubbery I'm experimenting with wet on wet. Um, the dry brush along the driveway looked a little bit too cool. It is dry brush. It has kind of an ochre sienna look. So I'm experimenting with adding just a little bit more of the yellow orange wet on wet, keeping it very thin, not wanting it to be of the same value as the brush in the foreground. This is a knoll that goes up to the oak tree, and that brush, we want to keep that in the foreground. Okay, so now I'm working on that foreground part of the tree, that large grouping of leaves, um, and once again, really just looking for those large organic shapes. What do those large organic shapes look like? What does that cluster of leaves look like? Okay, so I'm going into the foreground area of the painting with a much deeper blue-green mixture. This is a mixture of the ultramarine blue with the Winsor red, and as you can tell, I've put more yellow quantity in this to get that blue-green um, color tone in the foreground. And I've thinned out that blue-green color, so we do get a middle tone. So I'm moving between our lightest lights in the background to create atmosphere, and then I have a middle tone, which I'll lighten up with water later, and then I have the really deep blue-green in some areas in the foreground. You could always experiment with just adding a drop of water into an area that already has pigment, and it will create a nice wet on wet effect. And that's what I'm going after here, is just creating a large organic shape. And then if I go in and add a little bit of water into that shape, it will thin out some of that paint, and then it will give you that sense of atmosphere. And some of the middle ground values are getting a little bit too heavy, so I'll go in and add water and lighten those up a bit. Now I'm just going into the leaf clusters and really wanting to create unity in that tree. I don't want to fragment the left side of the painting from the right side. Um, However, I also don't want it to get too dark and too heavy, so I'm adding a little bit of water, as you can see. That's going to thin out some of those values. Then I dry the brush and I can pick up the excess. So I added water, it thinned out the wash right on top of the painting. And now that oak tree is sitting on a knoll, and I don't want it flying above it. I want it to be in the ground. So I'm adding a little bit more value there. And this is the final painting. You can see where I went in and lightened up some of the areas with some water and dabbed up the pigment so that you have that tonal atmospheric feeling.